Hello and welcome to this week's Midweek Reflection. I've chosen for my subject this evening time, and Christopher will now read a passage from one of the books of the Old Testament.
The Old Testament reading is taken from the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What gain have the workers from their toil? I have seen the business that God has given to everyone to be busy with. He has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, he has put a sense of past and future into their minds. Yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Not long after lockdown, my watch stopped working. I know it has one of those tiny batteries concealed within it that necessitates a special tool to remove its cover, so I need to wait until the shops reopen to get it mended. For a day or so, I wandered around looking for an alternative timepiece, and in our living room I reflected how much I missed the chime of the old grandfather clock, his face stilled since an enthusiastic toddler had discovered its pendulum. Oh, why had I procrastinated and not got it fixed for times such as now? However, with time pressures eased, at least I had time to stand and study its face, and I found myself wondering, who was the clockmaker who painted the thatched cottage and had a tiny figure that stood in front of the house? And indeed, there were 4 cottages, one in each corner, and 4 slightly different figures, dressed just slightly differently and holding different tools. He signs himself proudly on the clock face and notes the town of Brosley, now called Broseley, but better known 150 years later as one of the towns of Telford, a new town of the 70s era in the Midlands. How that industrial landscape has changed since that clockmaker knew his season on Earth. Physicists define time as the progression of events from the past to the present and into the future. And time is not something we can see, touch or smell, but we can measure its passage. Or another definition of time: a period of time, whether long or short, during which you do something or something happens. And it's worth saying at this point, time is man-made, but eternity belongs to God. Eternity may be described in a simple way as existing always and without an end or a beginning. To return to our theme of time, a friend who has a large family and many grandchildren wrote to say what a treat lockdown was proving to be, a time to indulge in my own company and to tend the allotment. My experience is a similar positive one, but I realise for many people this time has been a very difficult one with many challenges to be overcome. So what can we learn about time from our Bibles? It is a recurring theme in no less than 19 of the 66 books of the Bible. Tonight's reading, which came from the Old Testament from Ecclesiastes, is part of our wisdom literature in the Bible and explores the value of life, and in this particular chapter, the topic of time. As a Christian, I believe God created every season for a purpose. There is a season in our lives for singing, laughing, dancing, loving others and being loved. But there is also the season when we struggle in our relationships and possibly we find ourselves without meaningful jobs and or losing our homes and all that was ever constant around us. Many at this time are crying out in anguish, mourning their loved ones and grieving. With lockdown, this season brings the additional challenges that families cannot accompany those they love to the end of their lives. How can we possibly cope with times of such utter darkness and despair? How can we believe that, as verse 11 says, everything is beautiful for its own time? But I know that it is often in that darkest hour we can discover a joy of living through the actions of others towards us. It is the compassion of our doctors, nurses and other healthcare professionals that has helped to sustain so many families through this terrible time. Their loving care brings joy to suffering hearts. In that same verse we read, "He has planted eternity in the human heart." But even so, people cannot see the scope of God's work from beginning to end. God has planted an awareness of eternity, of the infinite, in each of our hearts, just as the gardener sows his seeds, uncertain of the outcome, so God reserves for himself that understanding of eternal life. But it is essential that we should trust God through these uncertain times and be in awe of him who is eternal and through the resurrection of his Son promises hope and eternal life after death to all who believe in him. Finally, time is precious. When a day is gone, we will never be able to get it back, and the only way to get to tomorrow is to live for today. Time is a gift given by God. In conclusion, for those wondering if I found a timepiece, My daughter sent me a modern invention. Not only do I now look at the time, but this timepiece also reminds me to keep fit and urges me to do 10,000 steps every day. Time and good health are indeed precious gifts to be treasured and to be used wisely. And I close now with a short Celtic prayer. May every task we do be done with joy, and every word that we employ show the Lord in heaven above that all we do for love. Amen.